As the sun set, Officer Carter took one last look at the framed calculator before heading home. You know, he said to no one in particular, sometimes the best things in life come from our biggest mistakes. You just have to be brave enough to learn from them. 6 months had passed since that autumn evening when two officers had stopped a teenager walking home. The police department's community center, once a quiet building used mainly for paperwork, now buzzed with activity every day. Today was special, though. It was graduation day for the first class of the new Community Bridge program. The main hall was packed with families, officers, and community members. At the front of the room, Officers Carter and Wilson stood alongside the chief's son, all three of them wearing matching blue t-shirts with "Building Bridges" printed across the front. The cracked calculator, now framed, hung on the wall behind them, a permanent reminder of how one incident had sparked real change. When I look back at that night, Officer Carter began, addressing the crowd, I see a different person. Someone who thought he was doing his job, but was really just acting on prejudice. Today, I see so much more. I see faces, stories, lives, dreams. Officer Wilson nodded, stepping forward. 6 months ago, we made a mistake that could have ended our careers. Instead, it became the beginning of something important. Today, we're celebrating 30 new graduates of our Youth Police Partnership program. But we're also celebrating a change in how we approach policing. The chief's son, now a senior preparing for college, took the microphone. Sometimes good things can come from bad situations. That night changed me too. I was angry at first, hurt, but then I saw an opportunity. We all did. Look around this room. Every person here is part of that change. The graduates sat in the front rows, teenagers and officers who had spent the past 6 months working together, learning from each other. They had organized community events, created youth advisory boards, and built relationships that went far beyond the usual police-community dynamics. A young student stood up to share her story. When I joined this program, I was scared of police officers. My little brother still crossed the street when he saw them coming. But working with Officer Carter and Officer Wilson showed me something different. They didn't just talk about change, they lived it. The crowd applauded as Chief Richardson took the stage. 6 months ago, a video went viral showing two of our officers making a terrible mistake. Today, we're viral for something else. He clicked a remote, and the screen behind him lit up with news coverage of their program. Stories of officers playing basketball with kids, helping with homework, attending family dinners. Real connections being built, day by day. Our arrest rates are down, the chief continued. Community trust is up. Complaints against officers have dropped by 60%. But the numbers don't tell the whole story. The real change is in the relationships we're building. Officer Carter and Wilson had been transformed by their experience. No longer just patrol officers, they had become leaders in community policing. Their story was being used in training sessions across the country as an example of how to turn a mistake into an opportunity for growth. The chief's son stepped forward again. Remember that calculator they broke that night? We could have just replaced it and moved on. Instead, we kept it as a reminder. Because sometimes broken things can lead to better things being built. He gestured to the graduating class. These officers and students spent 6 months really getting to know each other. They shared meals, stories, fears, and hopes. They learned that behind every uniform is a person, and behind every teenager is a future waiting to unfold. The ceremony continued with presentations of certificates, but they were more than just pieces of paper. Each one represented countless hours of shared experiences, difficult conversations, and growing understanding. Officers who had once seen only threats now saw potential. Young people who had once seen only badges now saw allies. As the event wound down, Officer Wilson approached the chief's son. You know, I'm still sorry about that night, but I'm grateful for what came after. You could have just been angry, but you chose to help create change instead. The boy smiled. That's what leadership looks like. Sometimes it means taking something painful and using it to help others. Speaking of which, he pulled out a college acceptance letter. I got into the criminal justice program. Still planning to be an officer, just a different kind than I imagined before. The community center emptied slowly that evening, but its impact would continue to ripple outward. The program was being adopted by other departments, spreading the message that real change was possible when people were willing to learn from their mistakes and do the hard work of building trust. 2 weeks had passed since that fateful night. The community center's main hall was filled with an unusual mix of people: police officers in civilian clothes, teenagers from local schools, community leaders, and concerned citizens. At the front of the room, Officers Carter and Wilson stood nervously beside the chief's son, preparing for their first community dialogue session. The room buzzed with conversation, some skeptical, some hopeful. The viral videos had indeed sparked a citywide conversation, but what happened next would determine whether that conversation led to real change. "I never thought I'd be standing here," Officer Wilson began, his voice shaky but determined. "2 weeks ago, I was the problem. Today, I'm hoping to be part of the solution." He glanced at the chief's son, who gave him an encouraging nod. Officer Carter stepped forward next. "We've spent the past 2 weeks listening, really listening, to stories from our community. Stories that were hard to hear, but necessary to understand. Stories that sound too much like what we did that night." The chief's son had organized the session as part of his expanded role in the youth program. The cracked calculator from that night sat on display at the front of the room, a symbol of what happens when prejudice goes unchecked. A young student raised her hand. "How do we know this isn't just for show? That things will actually change?" The question hung in the air for a moment before Officer Wilson responded. "That's fair. Words are easy. Actions matter more. That's why we're here, not to talk at you, but to learn from you, to understand your experiences, to do better." The next hour unfolded with raw honesty. Students shared stories of being followed in stores, of crossing the street when they saw police cars, of parents giving them the talk about how to survive encounters with law enforcement. Officers listened, many hearing these perspectives for the first time. One older officer in the audience stood up, tears in his eyes. "I've been on the force for 20 years, he said, "and I'm just now realizing how many times I might have made the wrong call, seen threats that weren't there because of my own biases." The chief's son shared his story again, but this time with a different emphasis. "What happened to me made the news because of who my father is," he explained. "But it shouldn't take being the chief's son to be treated with respect and dignity. Every person deserves that basic human right." As the session continued, something remarkable began to happen. The invisible wall between us and them started to crumble. Officers shared their own fears and uncertainties. Teenagers offered suggestions for better community engagement. Ideas flowed freely. A mentorship program, regular sports events between police and youth, ride-along opportunities for community members. A local pastor stood up. "This is a start," he said, "but we need to make sure these conversations continue, that they lead to real policy changes." Chief Richardson, who had been quietly observing from the back, stepped forward. "We're implementing new protocols," he announced. "Body cameras will be mandatory. De-escalation training will be doubled. But more importantly, every officer will spend time in community engagement programs like this one, not as authority figures, but as partners in building a safer community for everyone." Officers Carter and Wilson shared their new assignments, working with the youth program, leading community outreach efforts, and helping to train other officers about the dangers of implicit bias. Their story had become a teaching tool, an example of how confronting mistakes could lead to positive change. The chief's son pulled out his new calculator, a replacement for the one that had been broken. "This calculator," he said, holding it up, "represents something important. Yes, it's new, but the old one still sits here as a reminder. Because some things shouldn't be replaced and forgotten. They should be remembered and learned from." As the session wrapped up, people didn't rush to leave. Instead, small groups formed, officers talking with teenagers, parents sharing concerns with patrol supervisors, community leaders planning future events. The atmosphere had shifted from tension to cautious hope. Officer Wilson approached the chief's son. "Thank you," he said simply, "for helping us learn instead of just punishing us." The boy smiled. "Sometimes the best teachers are the mistakes we make. It's what we do after that counts." Outside, the autumn sun was setting, casting long shadows across the community center parking lot. But inside, new connections were being forged, bridges were being built, and the first real steps toward change were taking root. The impact of his words was visible on every face in the room. This wasn't just the chief's son speaking, this was the voice of every young person who had ever been unfairly profiled, given a chance to be heard. Officer Wilson stood up again. "I'd like to volunteer to lead the first community dialogue session, not as an instructor, but as someone who needs to learn." Officer Carter joined him. "Me too. And I'd like to apologize properly to everyone in this room, but especially to you." He looked at the chief's son. "We let down everything that badge stands for last night." The chief watched as other officers began raising their hands, volunteering for various aspects of the new initiatives. Something was shifting in the room, a recognition that real change required more than just new policies. It required open hearts, willing minds, and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. As the meeting continued, plans were made, committees formed, and a new path forward began to take shape. Outside the station, the city was waking up to those viral videos, but inside, something more important was happening. A department was waking up to the need for genuine transformation. The next morning arrived with a kind of crisp autumn chill that made coffee cups steam more than usual. The police station's briefing room was packed, not just with the usual shift officers, but with every available member of the force. Word had spread fast, and nobody wanted to miss this meeting. Chief Richardson stood at the front of the room, his presence somehow both stern and compassionate. His son sat in the back row, still in his school uniform, homework spread across his lap. He'd insisted on being present, turning what could have been a moment of shame into an opportunity for change. "Before we begin," the chief addressed the room, "I want to make something clear. What we're about to discuss isn't about pointing fingers or placing blame. It's about learning and growing as a department and as human beings." Officers Carter and Wilson sat in the front row, their uniforms replaced by civilian clothes, a visible reminder of their administrative leave status. The chief nodded to them, and Officer Carter slowly stood up, his hands visibly shaking. "Last night," he began, his voice barely above a whisper, "Officer Wilson and I made a series of decisions that we can't take back. We saw a young man walking in what we considered an unexpected neighborhood. We didn't see a student heading home. We didn't see a volunteer who helps with our youth programs. We didn't see someone's son. We saw what our biases told us to see." The room was silent. Some officers looked down at their notepads, others watched intently. In the back, the chief's son continued his calculus homework, but his pencil had stopped moving. Officer Wilson stood up next, clearing his throat. "We've all had training about profiling. We've all sat through the seminars. But last night, I realized something. Knowing about bias isn't the same as recognizing it in yourself. We hurt someone last night. We damaged trust that took years to build, and we did it without even checking an ID first." The chief stepped forward again, pressing a button on the remote. The screen behind him came to life, showing the social media videos from the previous night. The footage played in silence, but the impact was deafening. Officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats as they watched their colleagues harass a teenager who was simply walking home. "These videos have over 100,000 views now," the chief said quietly. "But this isn't about viral videos or public relations. This is about the fundamental trust between police officers and the community we serve. This is about doing better." He clicked to the next slide, showing a series of new initiatives. "Starting today, we're implementing changes. Every officer will be paired with a community mentor, someone from the neighborhoods we serve who can share their experiences and perspectives. Our youth program will be expanded, with a focus on building bridges between officers and young people." An older sergeant raised his hand. "Chief, we've had sensitivity training before. How is this different?" The chief's son looked up from his homework, watching the exchange with interest. "Because this time," the chief replied, "we're not just learning about the community, we're learning from them." Officer Carter and Officer Wilson will be working directly with our youth program participants. They'll hear firsthand about what it feels like to be profiled, to be treated as suspicious for simply existing in their own neighborhoods. He walked to the back of the room, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "My son has been helping with our community programs for years. He believes in what we do. Or at least he did until last night. Now we have to show him, and everyone else, that his faith in us isn't misplaced." The boy stood up, surprising everyone, including his father. "May I say something?" The chief nodded, and the room watched as the teenager walked to the front, his calculus homework still in hand. "I've spent years telling my friends that most police officers are good people trying to do the right thing. Last night tested that belief, but what happens next is what really matters. You have a chance to show that change is possible, that mistakes can lead to growth, that trust can be rebuilt." As the reality of their situation sank in, both officers seemed to physically deflate in their chairs. But there was something else in their expressions now, not just shame or regret, but the beginning of understanding. Outside the office, the night shift continued its routine, but everyone knew that tomorrow would be different. Change was coming to the department, sparked by one incident, but aimed at addressing a much larger issue. As Officer Carter and Wilson left the chief's office that night, they carried with them not just the weight of their mistakes, but the responsibility of becoming part of the solution. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Chief Richardson led the somber procession through the quiet hallways. It was nearly 9 p.m., and the night shift was just settling in. Officers at their desks looked up as their chief walked past, his son beside him, followed by two very uncomfortable-looking officers, Carter and Wilson. The whispers started immediately. Everyone knew the chief's son attended the prestigious private school on the hill, the same school where the chief's wife taught advanced mathematics. The family was well known and respected in the community. As word of what happened spread through the station, faces showed shock, disappointment, and in some cases, knowing resignation. The chief's office was larger than most, with awards and commendations lining the walls. He'd earned every one of them through his dedication to fair and equal policing. Now, as he sat behind his desk, those accolades seemed to stare down at Officers Carter and Wilson, who stood rigidly at attention. "Sit," the chief commanded, pointing to the chairs. His son had taken a seat on the leather couch near the window, his repacked backpack beside him. The calculator was still cracked, a visible reminder of the evening's events. "Before we begin," the chief said, his voice measured and calm, "I want you both to understand something. What happens next isn't about me being an angry father, though believe me, I am. This is about being a police chief who just witnessed two of his officers racially profile and harass an innocent young man." Officer Wilson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Sir, we were just following protocol for suspicious." "Suspicious?" The chief interrupted, his eyebrows rising. "Please, Officer Wilson, explain to me exactly what was suspicious. The school uniform? The backpack? The fact that he was walking home from school in his own neighborhood? Or was it something else?" The silence in the room was deafening. Even the usual sounds of the police station seemed muted, as if the very building was holding its breath. "Dad," the boy spoke up from his place on the couch, "they never even checked my ID until after I called you. They just assumed." The chief nodded, then turned back to his officers. "Do you know what my son wants to be when he grows up?" Neither officer spoke. "He wants to be a police officer, or at least he did until tonight. He's been volunteering at our community outreach programs since he was 13. He helps run the junior cadet program. And tonight you showed him exactly why some people in our community don't trust the police." Officer Carter's face had grown increasingly pale. "Chief, we had no idea." "That's exactly the problem," the chief cut in. "You had no idea because you didn't bother to find out. You saw what you wanted to see and acted on your prejudices. Now, let me show you something." He turned his computer monitor around. On the screen was footage from multiple angles, cell phone videos already uploaded to social media, showing the entire incident. The officers watched themselves through the eyes of the community and for the first time truly saw how their actions looked. "Those videos have thousands of views already," the chief said quietly. "By morning, they'll have more. Our community will be asking questions, and they deserve answers. But more importantly, they deserve change." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. "Here's what's going to happen. First, you're both on administrative leave, effective immediately. When you return, you'll be assigned to our Community Outreach Division. You'll work directly with the people you're supposed to protect and serve." The officers nodded silently, knowing they were getting off relatively lightly. Additionally, the chief continued, you'll both undergo extensive retraining with a focus on implicit bias and community relations. You'll also participate in our youth mentorship program, not as authorities but as learners. The teenagers in that program will have a lot to teach you about their daily experiences. He turned back to face them. This isn't punishment. This is education. This is growth. This is your chance to become the kind of officers our community needs and deserves. The boy on the couch sat up straighter, watching his father with newfound admiration. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. This was about systematic change. One more thing, the chief added, his voice softening slightly. Tomorrow, you'll both attend our morning briefing. You'll share what happened tonight with your fellow officers. Not as a confession, but as a lesson. Because if this can happen to the chief's son, it can happen to anyone's son. And that stops now. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the 3 police vehicles prepared to leave, everyone present knew they had witnessed something significant. This wasn't just about one incident or 2 officers' mistakes. This was about to become a catalyst for real change in the department. The phone call changed everything. As the words "bring your badge" hung in the air, Officer Wilson's hand, still holding the phone, began to tremble slightly. The voice that had answered on the speaker was unmistakable. It belonged to Chief Anthony Richardson, their commanding officer and one of the most respected police chiefs in the state. "Son, are you okay?" The chief's voice crackled through the speaker, concern mixed with controlled anger. "Who's there with you?" Before the boy could answer, Officer Carter jumped in, his voice suddenly higher than usual. "Chief, this is Officer Carter with Officer Wilson. We were just conducting a routine." "Stop talking," the chief cut him off sharply. "I'll be there in 3 minutes. Nobody moves until I arrive. Is that clear?" Both officers stood frozen, their faces pale in the streetlight. "Yes, sir," they mumbled in unison. The boy finally allowed himself a small, tired smile, not of triumph, but of relief that this ordeal would soon end. The neighbors who had been watching now moved closer, their curiosity overwhelming their previous hesitation. The elderly woman from across the street finally spoke up, her voice shaking with emotion. "I should have said something sooner. I see him walking home from school every day. He helps me with my groceries on weekends." Officer Wilson looked at the scattered belongings on the ground, the cracked calculator, the disheveled papers, the expensive textbooks, and began to realize the magnitude of their mistake. He started to bend down to pick things up, but the boy's quiet voice stopped him. "Please leave everything as it is. My father will want to see exactly what happened here." The autumn wind picked up, rustling through the trees and stirring the papers on the ground. Those 3 minutes of waiting felt like hours. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the occasional whispers from the growing crowd of onlookers. Then they heard it, the distinctive sound of a police car's engine, growing louder as it approached. The crowd parted as the chief's vehicle turned the corner, its headlights illuminating the scene like a spotlight on a stage. Chief Richardson stepped out of his car, and the atmosphere instantly changed. He was a tall man with graying temples and an air of authority that needed no announcement. He wore a crisp suit with his badge visible on his belt, but it was his eyes that commanded attention. They took in everything at once: his son's stance by the patrol car, the scattered belongings, his officer's nervous expressions. "Dad," the boy said simply, finally letting his shoulders relax. The chief walked over to his son first, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Are you hurt?" "No, sir. Just..." He gestured at his belongings strewn across the sidewalk. The chief nodded, his jaw tightening as he surveyed the scene. He picked up the cracked calculator, turning it over in his hands. The silence was deafening as he then walked over to the 2 officers, who stood at attention, sweat visible on their foreheads despite the cool evening air. "Officers," he began, his voice deadly calm, "would you like to explain why my son's belongings are scattered across the sidewalk? Why you're searching him 6 houses away from our home? Why his calculator is broken?" Officer Carter cleared his throat. "Sir, we didn't know he was your..." "Stop right there." The chief held up his hand. "Think very carefully about what you're about to say. Because if you're suggesting that this would be acceptable if he wasn't my son, we have an even bigger problem than I thought." The gathered crowd had grown larger, with many residents now openly recording the scene on their phones. The elderly woman stepped forward again, addressing the chief directly. I watched the whole thing, she said, her voice stronger now. They didn't let him explain. They didn't check his ID first. They just saw. She trailed off, but everyone understood what she meant. The chief looked at his son again, who was still standing tall despite everything. Then he turned back to his officers, his voice now carrying the weight of not just a father's anger, but the responsibility of a leader who needed to address a systemic problem. Both of you get in your patrol car, he ordered. Follow me back to the station. We're going to have a very long conversation about what happened here tonight. He paused, then added, and about what's going to happen next. The neighbors began helping the boy gather his belongings, many offering quiet words of support or apologizing for not speaking up sooner. As the officers slunk back to their patrol car, the chief helped his son pack his things, checking each item for damage. The humiliation began in earnest as Officer Wilson circled the young man like a predator, his boots scuffing against the scattered papers and books on the ground. The streetlights now fully illuminated the scene, creating harsh shadows that made everything feel more dramatic and tense. Neighbors continued to watch from their porches and windows, their silence a heavy weight in the cool evening air. These textbooks, Officer Carter said, picking up the AP physics book with suspicious eyes. Pretty expensive stuff. Where'd you really get them from? He flipped through the pages roughly, causing a few loose notes to flutter to the ground. The boy watched his carefully written homework assignments scatter across the sidewalk, his jaw clenching slightly. Sir, as I mentioned, they're mine. My name is written on the inside cover of each book. I'm in the advanced placement program at... Quiet. Officer Wilson snapped, cutting him off mid-sentence. He grabbed the leather backpack, turning it upside down and shaking it aggressively. A graphing calculator clattered to the ground, its screen cracking on impact. The boy flinched at the sound but remained steady, his hands still placed firmly on the patrol car's hood. A young couple walking their dog slowed down to watch the scene. The woman pulled out her phone and began recording, while her partner looked uncertainly between the officers and the boy. Is everything okay here? The man called out hesitantly. Police business, Officer Carter barked back. Keep moving. The couple lingered for a moment longer before reluctantly continuing their walk, throwing concerned glances over their shoulders. Officer Wilson picked up the MacBook Pro, turning it over in his hands. Brand new computer, expensive backpack, designer coat, all in a neighborhood where houses start at $1 million. You really expect us to believe this is all yours? The boy took a deep breath, his reflection in the car window showing remarkable self-control for someone so young. Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but this is profiling. I live here. Everything I own is legally purchased. If you just let me show you my ID. Oh, now you're going to tell us how to do our jobs. Officer Wilson's voice tricked with sarcasm. You think because you can use big words like profiling, that makes you some kind of expert on police work. The tension in the air grew thicker as more neighbors gathered to watch. Some whispered among themselves, others recorded with their phones, but none stepped forward to intervene. The boy noticed an elderly woman he'd often helped with her groceries watching from her porch, but even she remained silent, her face a mask of concern and indecision. Officer Carter began rifling through the boy's coat pockets, removing his wallet and phone. No ID in here, he announced triumphantly, as if this proved their suspicions correct. My student ID is in the front pocket, the boy said quietly, along with my driver's license. Officer Wilson snatched the wallet from his partner, opening the front pocket to find exactly what the boy had described. A student ID from one of the city's most prestigious private schools, along with a valid driver's license showing his address on Oak Street. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across Officer Wilson's face, but he quickly masked it with more aggression. These could be fake, he declared, though his voice carried less conviction now. We'll need to verify everything. The boy's shoulders slumped slightly, not from defeat, but from a deep wariness that seemed beyond his years. May I at least make a phone call? He asked, his voice still remarkably composed. You have my phone right there. One call, that's all I'm asking for. The officers exchanged glances, a silent conversation passing between them. Finally, Officer Carter shrugged. Fine. One call. But put it on speaker, no funny business. As Officer Wilson held out the phone, the boy straightened up slightly. There was something in his posture now, a subtle shift that might have warned the officers if they had been paying attention. Instead, they watched with smirks as he dialed a number they would soon wish he hadn't. The phone rang twice before someone answered. The boy's voice, clear and steady, spoke words that would change everything. "Dad, I need you to come to the corner of Cedar and Oak right now. You might want to bring your badge." The smirks vanished from the officers' faces as they heard the response on the other end of the line. The voice was authoritative, commanding, and terrifyingly familiar. In that moment, as understanding dawned on their faces, both officers realized they had made a catastrophic mistake, one that would have consequences far beyond this autumn evening. The autumn sun was setting over the tree-lined streets of Highland Park, casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns and elegant homes. Two police officers, Bill Carter and Tom Wilson, were cruising in their patrol car, having just finished their coffee break at the local diner. Officer Carter, a 12-year veteran with graying temples, was behind the wheel, while Officer Wilson, younger and more eager to prove himself, scanned the neighborhood with sharp eyes. That's when they spotted him, a young black teenager walking down Cedar Avenue. He wore a crisp private school uniform under an expensive-looking navy blue winter coat, carrying what appeared to be a leather backpack. Something about the sight made both officers exchange knowing glances. In their minds, the math wasn't adding up. This neighborhood, with its million-dollar homes and luxury cars, rarely saw anyone walking alone at this hour, especially someone who didn't seem to belong. "Let's check this out," Officer Wilson suggested, already reaching for his radio. Officer Carter nodded, slowing the patrol car down and flipping on the lights, but not the siren. The boy continued walking, his posture straight and confident, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. The patrol car pulled up alongside him, and both officers stepped out. The boy stopped, turning to face them with a composed expression that somehow irritated Officer Wilson even more. There was something in the boy's calm demeanor that didn't match their expectations of guilt or fear. "Hands where we can see them," Officer Carter barked, his hand instinctively resting on his belt. The boy slowly raised his hands, his expression a mixture of confusion and controlled frustration, an expression that spoke of someone who had perhaps been through this before. "Is there a problem, officers?" the boy asked, his voice steady and well-spoken. His question seemed to further agitate Officer Wilson, who stepped closer, his boots crunching on the fallen autumn leaves. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Wilson demanded, circling around the boy like a shark. "Where did you get that bag, that coat?" Each question came out more aggressive than the last. "I'm walking home," the boy replied calmly, keeping his hands visible. "I live 3 houses down on Oak Street. The corner house with the blue shutters." Officer Carter snorted. "Right, the Thompson residence? You expect us to believe that?" "No, sir. I don't live at the Thompson house. I can show you my ID and—" "Empty the bag," Wilson interrupted, pointing at the leather backpack. "Dump it all out. Right here, right now." A small crowd of neighbors had begun to gather on their porches, watching the scene unfold. Some pulled out their phones, recording discreetly. The boy looked at them briefly, a flicker of hope crossing his face, but none stepped forward to intervene. The silence of the bystanders seemed to echo louder than any words. Maintaining his composure, the boy carefully knelt down and began emptying his backpack. Out tumbled advanced textbooks, advanced placement physics, calculus I, modern literature, a MacBook Pro in a protective case, a scientific calculator, a water bottle from an exclusive private school. Everything spoke of privilege and wealth, but the officers had already made up their minds about what they were seeing. "Where did you get all this?" Officer Wilson demanded, using his foot to spread the items across the sidewalk. "These aren't yours, are they? Did you just leave someone's house? Is that what happened?" The boy's hands trembled slightly, but his voice remained steady. "Everything here belongs to me, sir. I can prove it. All my books have my name in them. The laptop has my school ID sticker. If you just let me." "Stop talking," Officer Carter cut him off. "Turn around, hands on the car. We're going to do this by the book." The autumn wind picked up, scattering fallen leaves across the boy's scattered belongings. The sun had nearly set now, and the street lights were flickering to life, casting harsh shadows across the scene. The boy stood there, his back to the patrol car, his reflection visible in the window. In that reflection, despite the humiliation and anger he must have felt, his eyes held something the officers hadn't expected, not fear or submission, but a quiet certainty that justice would prevail. Little did these officers know that their next few minutes would completely transform their lives, careers, and understanding of their own prejudices. As they continued their baseless search, the boy reached slowly for his phone, and what happened next would send shockwaves through the entire police department.